issues until 4 o'clock this afternoon, but we might even finish a little bit earlier. It also depends on the complexity of your questions. Well, I can actually skip this side because we do it very well. The etiquette, our etiquette to work on the webinar, so that will be fine. I hope people are finding their way on the e-campus for those that did not attend the previous session, and they can have a look at the webinar session. We don't edit it. You will see the whole recording. Some people said to me, why don't you cut off while you are talking, while I am talking? Let's just go to the main part of the webinar, but I think it's just easier to have the whole session and then you can scroll through it. Okay, let's, before I want to hand over to my colleague Nash, who's our specialist in terms of working time and wages, I would like to do a quick recap of the previous webinar and to see if we paid attention to Gita's presentation. She covered a lot of ground. I realized that, but let's see. So I have a little quiz that I did. So I would like to ask you now to go to this website. Let me see if the technology is helping me. So kahoot.it, I think many of you know it. I'll play it. I teach. So bear with me. I just have to launch the application. Your Kahoot is loading now. Classic. Okay, so please take your cell phone, I would say, or your iPad. And you can put in kahoot.it, www.kahoot.it, and then you can use, they will ask the PIN, and then you can put, and I see already two, we already are with two, so that's already fun. And then you can put in the game PIN number that is being asked. So I also do it. I don't know if you listen to the music. Can anybody hear the music? No, huh? Okay. 6. It will not be a long quiz, but it's 9-6. Enter. And I am anonymous. Anonymous. Good. 15. A few more. 27. If you are with 20, we start. I don't know how well it works when you do it on the computer, but this should be working. Okay. Yeah, let's start then. The others can then observe. It's not so difficult, the quiz, but it's a good, I think it's a way of recapping. So we are going to start now. Pay attention to the screen. Ta-da! So, quiz. In which year was the ILO MNE declaration adopted? You can choose between 1972, 76, or 77. Pure genius or not, huh? Yes, let us see. That's an easy one, huh? Well, they're all easy, actually. Oh. Okay, majority 1977, that is correct. 1977, that's the year that not only I was born, I'm from 1977, but it was also the year that the M&E Declaration was adopted. 1976. What happened in 1976? Who knows? What was adopted in 1976?
OECD guidelines.
Exactly, huh? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was done in 1976, and Elena also, I see, was born in 1976. And what happened in 1972? Also within the framework of our business, our responsible business. What happened in 1972? Anybody has an idea? No? Well, 1972 was started the whole attempt by the United Nations to come up with a code of conduct, with a governing framework concerning the behavior of transnational corporations. That started in 1972 already. So if we are talking about the guiding principles, this is work that already started in 1972. In the ILO M&E Declaration is actually something which remained from this broad overall code of conduct for transnational corporations, which didn't work out. The M&E Declaration is something which, but the M&E Declaration is a remaining part of that bigger framework that was designed in the early 70s. So 1972, you can Google it. It's a very interesting discussion. And you can see that we already are doing in this discussion almost for 50 years on responsible business conduct. And good. So 1977, let's go to the, and maybe also here to highlight, established in the brand is there already since 1977, but for those that were with us last week, it has been continuously updated, had to remain in line with the latest trends and happenings across the globe. Good, let's go for the next question. Oh no, I disabled the scores so nobody would be embarrassed. Good. True or false? The M&E Declaration only contains recommendations for multinational enterprises. So the M&E Declaration for multinational enterprises only contains recommendations for multinational enterprises. Is this true or is this false? Okay. Oh. Okay, I'm not going to ask who did say true. So let's, maybe I did it. I maybe pressed it wrong, but indeed, anybody can explain me their answer. So for who else does it has the recommendations or the principles, to whom are they directed? Anybody? Anybody wish to explain?
Well, the declaration or recommendations are for all three main players. So it's for companies, for governments, and also for the representatives of the workers. Could I say this? So basically, shortly.
Exactly, exactly. It's an instrument. It's the only almost instrument that has direct recommendations for enterprises, how to contribute to their operations to the realization of decent work, but at the same time also recognizes the responsibility of government also. It takes two to tango, and here you will see that within the M&E Declaration, the recommendations for companies, employees are mostly matched also with recommendations for governments. So indeed, and not only for multinational enterprises, you will see in the M&E Declaration, it also states for state and national enterprises, small and medium enterprises, but also state-owned companies. Are the ones that have semi-private public companies, So it's not only for multinational enterprises, but good. Let's go to the final question. Okay, this one is apparently being scored. Good. What is the role of a tripartite appointed national focal point for the promotion of the M&E declaration? What are the different functions of the ILO tripartite focal points? Raising awareness, maybe online information and dialogue platforms, capacity building, or all of the above? Good. Exactly. It's all of the above. As a rule, when you see a quiz question with all of the above, you know it's all of the above. It will rarely say differently, but indeed, the role of the ILO M&E declaration, it's mainly promotional in nature, promoting the M&E declaration with companies operating in their own territory or companies that are originating from the home country into the host country. Also providing these recommendations for companies that are operating abroad, providing online information and dialogue platforms in terms of challenges that might occur in the operations. So the tripartite focal points can organize dialogue platforms. Capacity building at the national level. You will see that the national tripartite focal points are organizing training for its members, for example, are providing training for its memberships, are creating awareness with their members on this topic. So these are the various functions of the tripartite appointed national focal points, which you can also find back in the ILO M&E declaration, all these different details. Okay, this was not too bad. I'm going to close here the quiz. You did a good job. So here are they again, in case there was a problem. Now, before I continue with Nash or with the session, was there anything else that that caught your attention on Wednesday in this long session, and that you think is worth mentioning at this moment? Something that caught your attention, maybe something that surprised you, and that you would like to share with the group from Wednesday's session on the M&E declaration. I can give you 1 or 2 minutes if something occurs. Or everything was crystal clear, that's even better then, huh? The presentation of specific provisions. Yes, John, that is a question you can ask Nash. He will be happy to answer that one.
I'm only relaying. I think it might have been Bell who asked in the last session, but yeah, yes. It's an interesting area.
Exactly. We'll keep that one for Naisha when he'll take the floor with his session. But the living wage discussion, that might be an interesting one. Mariana, you say presentation of specific provisions. You mean the specific principles that are going. In total, indeed, we have almost 50 or over 50 specific recommendations spread over the 5 different topics. Okay, let's. I propose we continue then. Yeah, indeed, the articles or the principles. I propose we continue then with the main topic of today on working time and wages issue. I believe on Wednesday we were joking that the topic will be that we work too much and we earn too little. I think we covered everything with that, Nash.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. Yeah.
No, thank you, Nash, for being with us. Nash is our go-to guy, huh, when it comes to wages and working time. And well, Nash, you can have the screen, huh, in this case. So you can also share your screen.
Okay. And from the beginning. Right. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Naj Gaucher. I work in the Inclusive Labor Markets, Labor Relations, and Working Conditions branch. It's rather a mouthful. We refer to ourselves internally as in work at the ILO here in Geneva, Switzerland. I've been working on wages and hours issues now for, oh goodness, probably over 15 years in one way, shape, or form. So hopefully I can bring you information that will be useful in your context. If I can't answer your questions, I will take the questions and gather information from Carl or from yourselves, and you can forward me the questions, and hopefully we can get you some follow-up. I'd like to say kind of at the beginning, just so you know, kind of in terms of how I'm looking to kind of proceed in this session. I'll go through the presentation sort of from start to finish, and then take questions at the end. I would strongly recommend that you write your questions either in the chat room, or you can write them to yourself and ask them, bring them up at the end, questions and comments. I'd like to firmly stress that there are no bad or stupid or ridiculous questions. They're just the questions that are unasked. So please feel free to ask whatever question you have in mind relating to these topics, and we'll do our best to kind of see if we can address them. So with that in mind, I'll proceed. And in the first instance, what I kind of wanted to do was kind of broadly speaking, kind of address what are the wage and hour issues that organizations have to deal with on a regular basis. I would say with some issues, it's more regular than others, but these are issues that always have to be considered by organizations, whether in the public or private sector. So with regard to working time and working time arrangements, issues that normally relate to working hours, the number of regular working hours and overtime hours. This is an important distinction in the work that we do, and it's an important distinction both in terms of hours and compensation for workers. Issues relating to full-time and part-time working hours. Working time arrangements. So not just the number of hours, which is what we were referring to when we talk about working hours, but how these hours are scheduled or arranged during a day, a week, a month, quarter, half year, full year. And there are new work arrangements, a few of which we are all currently experiencing and trying to adapt to, namely telework, which historically was more of a, I would categorize a little bit as something of a niche type of arrangement, but COVID has now brought it front and center and made it a real central consideration for social partners around the world. With regard to wages, of course, we talk about minimum wages or basic wages that might be paid. Wages more broadly spoke. So in instances where we're not talking, where a country or location might not have a minimum wage, the wages that are paid, but also the overtime wage or the overtime premia. We also examine issues relating to salary. These are concerns as well for a lot of organizations. Compensation, non-wage benefits. So any type of things like transport or meal vouchers or things of that nature tend to be issues associated with compensation. Equal pay measures is a very important issue that organizations have to address. It's an issue that's very prominent in the ILO in terms of examination and analysis, and also wage protection measures. So what are wage protection measures? Sort of very simply are measures to ensure predictable, timely, and complete payment of all wage and compensation that is owed to a worker. So it's ensuring that if you work a certain number of hours, you're promised certain compensation, that you're paid that compensation. It's that basically boils down to that. There's a lot of issues associated with that, but we'll get to that, to a few of those as we move along. We're also interested, and this is a personal interest as well. This is sort of a personal research interest. Wage protection in enterprises in reorganization or insolvency, where there are serious questions where enterprises in the private sector or organizations are experiencing serious financial difficulties. They may not have the resources to address all of their financial obligations, and for us, we want to make sure that that workers aren't left out in the cold under these conditions. So these are some of the issues that that we're concerned with, and certainly organizations. I think it's fair to say that COVID has strongly reawakened concerns about this in many parts of the world. So it's something that we're all sort of kind of paying attention to and considering at the moment. Now, one of the things I wanted to do, kind of to give you an idea of some of the issues that we're seeing, I thought it would give you some of the trends, kind of some of the things that we'd seen kind of in 2019, sort of pre-COVID, and then give you a flavor of what we're kind of finding in terms of what's going on as a result of COVID, and the implications for hours and for wages. So prior to the COVID outbreak, so through 2019, what we were finding with regard to working hours is there was what we would refer to as a bifurcation, a sort of segmentation. On the one hand, you had a lot of people who were working very long hours, which we would categorize as more than 48 hours a week. And then we had a sort of very dichotomous split with short hours or part-time work, less than 35 hours per week. And in that category, part-time work in many countries, for a lot of different reasons, tends to be you tend to find a large number of women working part-time, and you have a lot of young people working part-time, and you have, even in some parts of the world, older people who are working part-time. So it's and in some cases, it might be particularly in the case of women, it could be that they are older women or younger women. So again, this will impact on the numbers in terms of how many people are working in those categories when we disaggregate. But it was rather curious that it was a situation where those who were in full-time work were working, as Carl kind of noted at the beginning, working really long hours. But if a full-time job wasn't there, then everything goes to part-time. So there's a real kind of bizarre kind of split. Normally you would have something maybe a little bit more evenly spread, but that was the trend kind of leading into 2020. And you can see here the trend in terms of long hours, percentage of workers who are working long hours, more than 48 hours a week, was quite high. And to some extent, when you're doing a global analysis, you will always have a situation where there will be one group that might statistically kind of influence the sort of outcome. And in this case, it's working hours in East Asia. There's a lot of people there's a lot of workers in East Asia who work very, very long hours, long normal hours, and a lot of overtime. So we can see kind of the numerically how this works. It also might, to some extent, for those of you who hadn't really been sort of thinking about it, this also kind of explains why, with regard to globalization, there's a lot of basing of manufacturing in those regions, and this is kind of the result of basing that manufacturing in those regions, is that there's a lot of long hours work that's done in those regions in terms of manufacturing and production. The trends in terms of short hours work, as you can see, it's kind of hovers within a certain bandwidth, 16 to 18% between 2008 and 16 points. Sorry, let me start over. The share of involuntary part-time workers is up in many countries, 16.6% in 2008 to 18.2% in 2017. When we refer to involuntary part-time, the involuntary part-time are workers who are working involuntarily, as in they would work full-time if full-time was available, but for whatever reason in their local labor market, in the national labor market circumstances, they just can't get full-time work. And these are rather, as you can see, these are rather high numbers when you're considering sort of employment opportunities and the working hours associated with those employment opportunities. So it was something to bear in mind kind of going into the kind of COVID period. Now, with regard to wage trends, our colleagues in the wage group in our branch produced the Global Wage Report, and in the periods, so this is some information that was put together by those colleagues. Average real wage growth between 2008 and 2017. When we look at the information, there's been some growth. It's not been what you might categorize as an enormous change, but I mean, what's really kind of interesting in terms of the data is how much China can influence this data. Because as you can see, the yellow is the information, which is global information, but the orange is global when we take out China. And when we take out China, we can see that the real wage growth actually falls quite a bit in the global analysis. So China has a very strong influence on these trends. But again, the trends are, I mean, if we're looking at the global wage trend minus China, 0.06% in 2008, and by 2017, 1.1%. A peak of 1.8%. These are, I mean, roughly in line with inflation. So not a huge amount of growth, but some growth. One of the issues that we can see actually that's important as well is the gender pay gap. And what I found very interesting about this analysis was that when we look at the mean hourly wage and the median hourly wage around the world, we can see that the global sort of analysis is the numbers are not particularly great, but there seems to be maybe a little bit of a difference with high income countries. But when we get to the mean monthly wage and the median monthly wage, these numbers tend to change quite a lot. So there seems to be a rather large impact when we're talking about monthly wages as opposed to hourly wages. That could very well be because in some countries, there may not be a specific hourly minimum wage. It could be that a wage is paid, the minimum wage is paid as sort of a weekly or a monthly kind of wage, which may have a bearing in terms of the data that's collected. But I think the one thing that we can agree is that these numbers are still rather high. And it's one of the activities I think that the office has taken a very keen eye on, and is trying to work as actively as it can with constituents to address this gap. Now, when COVID, these wage trends were were sort of going in a certain direction, and then COVID kind of hit us straight between the eyes. So in the first half of 2020, as a result of the COVID crisis, there was a downward pressure on the level of growth of average wage rates in 2/3 of the countries. Now, this information is from the current global wage report, which I would strongly recommend you have a look at. This was released in December of 2020, so this is comparatively hot off the press. And they observed that the downward pressure was observed in 2/3 of the countries in which they collected data. And it was really, as I note here, is largely artificially as a reflection of the substantial job losses among low-paid workers. So to some extent, the downward pressure in terms of average wages was really due to some extent the loss of jobs of people who are working a lot of minimum wage jobs. The impact of the crisis on total wages have fallen differently on men and women. I don't think that's a terribly large surprise for anybody. It's been generally harder on women and affected lower paid workers, which again, we find a lot of women working in lower paid jobs. And this has contributed to an increase in wage inequalities. Temporary wage subsidies, which governments have provided in order to maintain organizations and companies and provide wages to workers who may not be able to work in a full-time sense or may not be able to go to their workplace to work. These temporary subsidies have enabled many countries to compensate part of the wage bill that would have been lost and lessen the effect of the crisis on wage inequality. So the aim of these subsidies really has been to diminish the problems and the outright closure of business and job losses that would have resulted because of the shutdowns that were happening in many parts of the world as it related to COVID. The analysis also includes data gathering on other subjects. So the report also indicates that as we stand at the moment, statutory negotiated minimum wages exist in 90% of the 187 ILO member states. So that's a fairly large number that have some form of negotiated minimum wages. Globally, as estimated, 327 million wage earners are paid at or below the applicable minimum wage. This figure represents 19% of all wage earners and includes 152 million women. So even though minimum wage may exist, there's a lot of places where it's not paid in full. And almost 20% of wage earners are in this. And it's a huge number of women, 152 million out of 327 million is a fairly substantial number. I mean, we're in this sort of almost half ballpark. Out of the estimated 327 million wage earners who are paid at or below the minimum wage, 266 million wage earners around the world earn less than the existing hourly minimum wage, either because they are not legally covered or because of non-compliance. So again, minimum wage or negotiated wages exist in a lot of places, but there are serious questions about whether or not, to what extent they're paid, or whether they're paid in full, or do they extend to all workers or to select workers? With regard to working hours, again, COVID has had an impact. Workplace closures continue to disrupt labor markets around the world, leading to working hour losses that are higher than previously estimated. In the first quarter of last year, an estimated 5.6% of global working hours were lost relative to the fourth quarter of 2019. That was equivalent to 160 million full-time jobs, assuming a 48-hour week. While lost hours of work may be a proxy for employment and unemployment, lost hours of work also worsen the situation of bifurcation of working hours for those in employment. So there's a lot of instances where if you can work, just as an example, there are a lot of instances where there's a lot of people who can, if you can work from home, more or less, your full-time probably employment conditions were more or less maintained. For a lot of people who work part-time, who worked in service sector jobs at restaurants, bars, whatever, these type of jobs are probably being hit very hard. And at the same time, the job opportunities which may exist in many of these instances may be with companies such as Uber deliveries or food delivery services, which again are not interested in full-time hours. These companies tend to emphasize part-time hours in terms of the work that people can do. They allow full-time, but they the people who tend to work them tend to work part-time, and where they do work full-time, that may be the only option that's available because of the COVID situation and the job opportunities in the market. One of the measures, as I mentioned, to keep people working during COVID is telework. We did an estimate last year to get a sense of the impact of telework, and the initial analysis indicated that 34% of jobs in the United States could plausibly be performed from home. 26 to 29% of occupations in Argentina could be performed remotely. The potential for remote work was 24% in Italy, 28% in France, 29% in Germany, 25% in Spain, and 31% for Sweden and the United Kingdom. But telework during COVID has raised a lot of issues. And it's very double-edged. And this is something that certainly from the office perspective, and certainly I can say in terms of my desk, this is something that we were inundated with last year. As I noted before, telework historically was more of a niche subject, niche type of arrangement, but COVID made it, I wouldn't say universal, but it made it very, very broadly used. And it's exposed a lot of very serious and significant questions in terms of working time, in terms of compensation, in terms of health and safety, a number of different issues. So while it's been helpful to in the crisis, sort of economic and sort of pandemic crisis, it is an area that's going to require some scrutiny in the future to try and balance out the particular concerns. Now I'm going to kind of give you an idea of the standards and the approach to working hours that the ILO takes, so you have a better idea in terms of our approach, kind of what influences our approach and how we engage with constituents. So in terms of the issues, the thematic approaches that we take, we look at the issues that are on this particular slide, and we kind of group them in more or less within these sort of categories. In the first instance, we talk about working hours. So when we talk about working hours, we're talking about the quantity, the number of working hours during a day or a week, and limits on those working hours. So, 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week for normal hours, sort of 2 hours a day and maybe 8 hours a week for overtime hours. Those are the things that we're looking at when we talk about working hours. We talk about working time arrangements. We're talking about the organization of hours during a day, a week, or a longer period that make up a work schedule. So in the sense, it's kind of working time arrangements are work schedules. And there's a lot of different ways to organize working time. There's flexi time systems, there's compressed work weeks. There are ways to do sort of hours averaging schemes over extended periods. So there's a lot of different ways that working hours can be organized. One of the things that we also stress as well are rest periods. Even machines need a periodic reboot, and I think we can all agree that we also need periods where we can kind of stop our work and kind of reboot and get some rest. So scheduling rest periods from working hours is important. Not just, but there's a lot of different rest periods that we try and emphasize and stress. Now these include daily meal breaks, rest breaks at work. So when we talk about that, it's things like coffee, for lack of a better term, coffee breaks, tea breaks, things of that nature. when we refer to daily rest, we're talking about the continuous number of hours between two work shifts. So, if we use a conventional 9 to 5 work day, we're talking about the period from 5:01 to 8:15, 5:01 from one day to 8:59 the next day. And that we try to emphasize the continuousness of that period. When we refer to weekly rest days, that's basically the weekend. So we advise anything from 24 to 48 hours in terms of weekly rest. And then we talk about annual leave. So the availability of leave days to take, in essence, vacation days, which is important to kind of not only get the rest, but have that rest away from the workplace. We also are look at what we refer to as emergency working time arrangements. So working time arrangements used during a national, provincial, or local emergency to maintain employment and enterprise viability. And these include policies such as work sharing, which we find in many industrialized countries. And we find, and work sharing kind of has a certain borders with wage subsidies. So it's about trying to keep enterprises viable, keep people working, keep income in people's pockets. Telework is another issue, is another subject that I think we can all agree has been used in the COVID pandemic as kind of an emergency measure. Job sharing in severe economic crisis can be very important. So when we refer to job sharing, we're talking about a job that's normally full-time that may be done part-time by two workers for a very specified period of time. And the anticipation would that be, excuse me, tripping over myself, that would be for a short period of time. We also have overlapping, what we refer to as overlapping issues between wages and hours, where the subject is very intertwined and it's very kind of difficult to separate. So these include things like overtime hours, because overtime hours is a working hour issue, but it's also an overtime pay issue. Piece rate work is an issue of production. It takes a certain amount of time, but you're paid by the piece. So there's a wage an hour component. Collectively bargained sectoral hours often involve overlaps between working hours and pay. So these are issues we address kind of as sort of overlap issues. With regard to minimum wages, we have, that's one of the issues that we talk about, the establishment of minimum wage through regulations or collectively bargained wages. As I mentioned, wage protection to ensure all owed wages are paid in a predictable, timely, and complete manner. And as I mentioned before, wage subsidies to maintain income and employment in a crisis situation such as COVID. The policies and measures, the policy sort of tools and measures that we kind of work through from an ILO perspective include international labor standards, so ILO conventions, recommendations on maximum working hours, part-time work, night work, weekly rest, annual leave, minimum wages, equal pay, wage protection, and insolvency. These are all standards that we do have standards, as you will see, on all of these subjects. The MNE declaration does include a link to the reduction of working hours recommendation. And in paragraph 41 addresses the importance of wages. So the MNE declaration does have very specific links to other international labor standards. So that's something to bear in mind when you're looking at that declaration. We tend to work on national legislation on wages and hours in both the public and the private sectors. So we have measures to address that. Collective bargaining on working time and wages, of course. Workplace scheduling of working time arrangements. So flexi time, compressed work weeks, technology based. These we have some. We have sort of tools that we work with to address those. Minimum wages and equal pay. As I noted, the ILO Global Wage Report from 2018. There's also the 2021, which provides, which not only gives us information about what are the trends, but how we can address those trends. We have, as I note, the overlapping thematic issues, overtime and piece rate, and then the wage protection measures to ensure wage payment. With regard to international labor standards, as I noted, there's a number of different international labor standards. These are a list of the standards that we actively use. With regard to working time and rest, in the ILO history, there have been over 40 standards addressing, 40 as in 40, standards addressing working time. So working time has been an issue of interest to ILO, to the social partners in the ILO and to the office since its inception. If you note, the Hours of Work Convention is number one. ILO Convention number 1 was on hours of work. And that was the first convention in the ILO's history, and it remains an active standard. Some of the standards that are not listed here have been withdrawn, mainly because they're sectoral based and they're based on a certain period of time. So the ILO used to have, for example, a standard on bottle blowing when bottle blowing was a little bit more manual and less mechanized. That's been withdrawn. There's a few of those that have been withdrawn, but the ones you see here are the ones that have been the ones that are currently being used in terms of the work that we do and the sort of legal and policy advice tools that we use to advise our constituents. As you note at the bottom of the reduction in working hours recommendation is linked to the MNE declaration. The ILO wage conventions and recommendations, the current ones that are being actively used are Convention on Minimum Wage Fixing 131, protection of worker wage claims, protection of workers, worker wages is also important. Convention 95, it's an area of particular interest in terms of the work that I do. And as I noted before, the protection of workers' claims and the employer's insolvency is both a convention and a recommendation. It's something that it forms an important part of our sort of work and advice. Just in terms of context, so you know that kind of the linkages, the ILO M&E declaration does link to working hours and wages. As I noted in a couple of the previous slides, the M&E declaration links to the reduction of hours recommendation, in that it requires each member to formulate, pursue national policy designed to promote appropriate national conditions and practices in each industry and adoption of the principle of progressive reduction of normal working hours. That's really kind of important to kind of keep in mind. Normal hours of work should be progressively reduced when appropriate with a view to attaining the social standard without any reduction in wages of workers as at the time of work is reduced. So the idea is to reduce the number of, not to reduce pay, but to reduce the number of hours that people work. Some might sort of consider this kind of pie in the sky, but realistically, this is I don't think it's something that we can say is completely overambitious. If we factor in productivity gains that may take place due to technology. So there's certainly scope for discussion about sort of the national and sort of state and local and workplace applications of the standard. The ILO M&E declaration also addresses wages and benefits and conditions of work. Where comparable, I wanted to emphasize, where comparable employers do not exist, they should provide the best possible wages, benefits, and conditions of work. These are important. This is an important paragraph because it's trying to emphasize that the level of wages that should be paid are very important, and M&Es need to bear this in mind, and as do as do the social partners, governments, and trade unions. And if you look at the elements to be taken into consideration, this is more or less what you will find in terms of ILO Convention 131 on minimum wages. This is thematically, there's a lot of linkages to this. So the M&E Declaration does recognize the importance of what we would categorize as decent working hours and decent wages in the context of employment. So it's not that the ILO conventions and recommendations are sort of isolated from the M&E Declaration. They are very intimately linked. I thought I would also bring in a little bit of a discussion about working time and wage measures to address COVID. So the emergency measures, as I mentioned, work sharing, and to kind of give you a more specific kind of definition, work sharing is a reduction of working time intended to spread a reduced volume of work over the same or similar number of workers in order to avoid layoffs, or alternatively as a measure intended to create new employment. It's often government funded to kind of limit the financial impact on workers. So it's important that all social partners be sort of coordinated in their efforts to implement these measures. The country I would say that I would say has led in this area historically has been Germany. They implemented measures in the late 1920s to address the Depression, and they have used forms of work sharing even to the present day to address economic crises that have developed. Telework, of course, use of ICT, technologies, smartphones, tablets, laptops, for the purpose to work outside the employer's premises. I think we all kind of, if we didn't know before, I think we're all now quite a bit more familiar with telework. Working time arrangements such as flexi time or staggered hours might be useful in transition back to the workplace. But again, it's the use of the return to workplace should be based on scientific and medical approvals in the country or the region. But the organization of these working hours, the scheduling of these working hours might be done in a manner that will maybe not limit, perhaps limit the spread of the virus. Certainly could be done in a way that doesn't make the virus worse. But again, the key conditionality there is the scientific and medical approval. Wage subsidies is the explicit objective is the maintenance or continuation of the employment relationship, an objective that is beneficial to both workers and enterprises. I think it's important with regard to as I say, wage subsidies and work sharing have sort of linkages as well. You might categorize that as sort of these subjects as sort of a cross thematic approach. The ultimate objective really is to kind of ensure that businesses don't go bankrupt, and that workers keep getting money in their pocket. It's as simple as that. And then the ultimate objective of work sharing and wage subsidies is not that they're permanent conditions, but they are conditions that help weather the storm, so that on the other side, enterprises that remain can begin to adapt to the new economic conditions, hopefully with regard to COVID. I think we can all agree, hopefully sooner rather than later. But when they come out the other side, the objective is that they can then sort of restart their business from an existing core, rather than having to start over from zero and have all of the costs associated with that, and new recruitment of workers and unemployment, which these measures also ensure that workers who are not working at their company can keep money coming in, which also means that they're not going on unemployment insurance. So wage subsidies and work sharing methods, while governments are paying a portion of the wage, providing a certain subsidy, I mean a certain percentage of the wage, it's not the same as them being on unemployment. So there's a savings for governments to some extent. And there's the benefit for the workers is clear. They're still getting an income and they still have their job. And hopefully when the enterprise gets back in form, they'll be able to return to a form of quote unquote normal or hopefully improved conditions as circumstances permit. There's a taxonomy to public interventions to support wages. This is kind of a sort of a diagram of the different types of approaches that have been used when we talk about some wage income support. So wage subsidies paid to enterprises, paid to workers. Work sharing it would be kind of within that sort of broad category. Tax credits have been used for general credits and reduced Social Security contributions, loans to enterprises, targeting wage bills, and based on other criteria, there have been those that target enterprises to provide subsidies and loans to ensure that maybe some low interest, longer term loans to ensure that enterprises can continue. I suppose I wouldn't maybe a sort of subcategory or an additional category, which is not sort of a wage support, but another measure that would be considered to help enterprises stay viable would be things like rent supports and things of that nature, which is also can be quite important to the overall financial stability of an enterprise. The ILO in 2019, we celebrated our centenary, and there was a lot of discussion about the future of work. None of us really anticipated a global pandemic, but there are a lot of things that I think were identified there that perhaps have accelerated. So some things haven't changed, but they have perhaps arguably organically taken a different sort of shape and size and perhaps level of importance. So working conditions in the globalized economy. At present, global supply chains, real serious issues, real serious concerns. There's a lot of disruption in terms of global supply chain production and availability in markets. Digitalization was an issue that we had started working on. And now it's going to be probably one of the defining features of the work going forward. Equal pay, I think, is going to be an issue until we can all get to the point in every part of the world where equal pay for equal work is sort of a non-issue. Where it's so widely accepted that we don't even have to consider it. This will be an area that the office will be working towards, and I think we have our work cut out even still. The ILO Future of Work Commission created the Universal Labor Guarantee, fundamental worker rights, including an adequate living wage, limits on hours of work, and ensuring healthy and safe workplaces. The commission, this guarantee will play a role in terms of the work that we're going to be pursuing and the engagement that we'll have with our social partners. I think there are issues that are certainly inspired by COVID-19. Where do you work from? Growth in telework and remote work. There's a real question at the moment whether telework is the new normal or not. Who's paying? Wage payments in many sectors are in trouble as business struggle to survive. Also tied to remote work, there are questions about if you work for a Silicon Valley based company, can you work in Trinidad and Tobago? Technologically, yes. But should the company pay you at the rate of pay in Trinidad and Tobago, or should they pay you the Silicon Valley rate, which are vastly different? Companies such as Facebook have indicated their openness to telework, but they have also suggested that it may impact on their wage and salary structure. So these are issues that are now coming to the fore. Inward outward focus, COVID's impact on globalization has consequences for wages and hours. As I noted, there's been big disruptions with regard to global supply chains. Protecting business and workers, these subsidies are meant to try and limit the impact of insolvency and ensure that workers are paid. But right now we have real big issues associated with that. I think once the wage subsidies and work sharing schemes begin to taper off, we're going to really start seeing the extent of the damage to some extent in national economies, and these measures are going to probably become much more of a wider concern to ensure that workers are not left out in the cold in terms of any sort of wages or compensation that might be owed. Final observation is that we produced a lot of materials to address these issues, and you know, as it says there, we do a lot of work on technical and legal assistance. So this is where I sort of stop, and this is where you have the opportunity now to engage, and I'll stop there and hand over to my colleague Carl, and hopefully and we can go from there.
Thank you, Nash. Thank you for this very comprehensive introduction to all the topics and issues. There were a few questions. Let maybe start with the question that always pops up, the one on living wage. It was already it was already mentioned in the past, in the beginning, several times. This question always comes up, so maybe we start with that one, and then there's the other question on the on-call time. So the principle of not working, no work, no pay. So let's start maybe with those two questions, and then I would. Any other question, please go ahead. I would say put it in the chat box, or take the floor once Nash finalized answering these two questions.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. I would say that with regard to the living wage, it's an interesting subject. The living wage is part of the ILO Constitution, but there have been serious questions for years about the balance between the minimum wage and whether or not a national living wage should be a minimum wage, or there's some kind of interrelationship between the two. My colleagues who are working on the minimum wage actually have been addressing this in a very focused manner recently. The demand actually prior to COVID had been going up, and in the European Union, there's been an increasing discussion not only about a European minimum wage, but whether or not that minimum wage should be a living based on a living wage. I would rather that's one of the subjects I would say I would prefer to put you in touch with my my colleague who has worked on this, to give you the econometric sort of sound econometric advice on this. It's a subject that I address more kind of the regulatory side than the sort of the quantitative econometric side. So I don't want to give you an answer that might mislead or kind of give you a sense of one direction or another. It's kind of, and I would say the main reason is because it's an organic subject at the moment. Because there's a huge amount of debate as to whether or not the living wage should be an active component in national minimum wage determination, or national wage determination, or collective bargaining determination. So I would, if you provide Carl or with your details, we can probably follow up with some supplementary information to give you the current level of thinking that my colleagues are using to address this very specific issue. I do apologize. It's just it's an area that is that's very nuanced in our building. I think it's important to recognize, one of the things I think it's important for all of you to recognize, and perhaps it's not something that we in the office are sort of, you know, broadly advertised, but I'll state the obvious in the sense that we're a tripartite organization. We're made up of employers, workers, and trade unions. That part you know. But in terms of achieving a sort of institutional statement or institutional position, we need to work with all three with all three groups. And as you can expect, there are very diverging views institutionally in terms of our approach and to what extent we should, you know, emphasize something or not emphasize something. So it's important to bear in mind that even though there have been long discussions internally within the office and in terms of engaging with other, with the national level social actors, it doesn't necessarily mean that that there's a sort of consensus of opinion on the living wage. If you ask different people in the ILO, you might get a different kind of perception. We do kind of try and sing from one hymn sheet once we get everybody on board. Social actors say, or the social partners say, this is the way we should do things. The office will work with that sort of guidance. But it's with regard to things like the living wage, it's a very fluid kind of situation at the moment. So that's something to bear in mind in terms of why you might, you know, I'm not trying to give you the sort of political diplomatic kind of answer, but that is something that does influence the work and the way we present and the way we discuss our work. So not just in terms of wages and hours, but across the board. So something to keep in mind. The other question was with regard to on-call work, I think it was. Is that correct? Yeah, with regard to on-call work is I think as the questioner has identified, is a real serious question that we're facing at the moment. And this was a pre-COVID question as well. To what extent, and on-call can take a lot of different sort of forms, if you will. On-call can be a situation where you have to be available online. You have to be available, in some instances, it may be that you have to be available to go to work. So for example, one sector of the economy where on-call is quite prevalent, for example, is in the medical profession. Doctors and nurses, especially during COVID situation, may be on call. So they go home, they're trying to get some rest, but hospital is overwhelmed. They say, we need you back. So that's certainly one dimension. Another dimension is you report for work. For whatever reason, there's no work to be done at that particular moment. So for example, in a restaurant, somebody might, a waiter or waitress might be scheduled to go to work. They show up for work. Question is, maybe the restaurant's opening too early, or so there's nobody coming in for lunch or for, you know, brunch or whatever during the week. And the question is, they're scheduled to work, there is no work, but they're at the workplace. So should they be paid? And this is sort of a kind of different kind of permutation of on-call work. I think the general position that we try and take with regard to on-call work is, if you're scheduled to work, in principle, and I'd like to emphasize in principle, if you're scheduled to work and you turn up for work, in principle, you should be paid for the time that you are at the workplace working. It's not the worker's fault that you're scheduled to work and not there. With regard to sort of the medical example, I think our concern with on-call work in that context is, when you're on call, in that context, you're not really on the time that you're not in the workplace is not really free time. You have to have your mobile phone in your hand, in your pocket, just in case. It has to be on just in case. That means that the rest that you would normally be scheduled for, or you'd be planning for, is not really fully rest. So you have a situation where people may not be able to go out, for example, they may not be able to go out with friends to dinner because they may need to leave. They may not be able to plan it. They may not be able to go to see a film. When the movie theaters were open, that being on call means that you might have to go into the theater, you watch 40 minutes of a film, you get the call, you have to leave. So it means that you can't really enjoy the period that you're away from that workplace. So that's a factor that kind of needs to be considered when you're thinking about on call, and in terms of how it should be addressed, how it should be structured, how it should be agreed between workers and employers. And it may have to some extent influence on the regulatory instruments. For example, any sort of national or provincial, state or provincial or local regulations, or even in terms of collective bargaining. So these are sort of the I suppose the points that need to be kind of borne in mind. I hope that answers the question to some extent, but I'll turn over to Carl for the moment to kind of go from there.
The question came from Francesca, huh? So was it good enough, the answer?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much. But there was another little part of my question about the no work, no pay principle, because we have seen this in a country in a specific circumstances that we are looking at with the French NCP. And so there was this principle applied, and also about the waiting day. So there are some legal provision by the state, the hosting country, that are quite tough for the workers, especially during the COVID crisis. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's an area that we've been. It's one of the areas that actually we addressed in the ILO General Survey on working time. I was one of the co-authors of that report, and this is for those of you who are not familiar, the ILO General Survey. The ILO does a general survey on specific international labor standards every year. Usually guided by constituents. The constituents will recommend a theme or a group of subjects that they feel that the office should be examining existing international labor standards, seeing how they're applied, seeing what's going on. And in 2017, the office was asked to do an analysis on the international labor standards, which the ones you saw on the screen were actually the standards that we looked at in terms of the general survey. And on-call work was one of the issues that came up in that sort of discussion. I can certainly share that document with you. So if you want to have a look at it sort of in depth to kind of get a sense of where we are, it's a problem I would say that the office is still wrestling with in terms of how that sort of, I mean, in principle, we can address it through collective agreements, we can address it through regulation, but at a certain point, it becomes a question of enforcement. How do we enforce an on-call measure and separation? I mean, one example that kind of comes to mind, there's some provincial legislation in Canada, and as I recall, I think it was Manitoba, which had regulations about on-call. So as you can imagine, as some of you can imagine, Canada at this time of the year, the weather is not exactly perfect. And the idea that you're going to drive from your home to the workplace through, and it's not an exaggeration to say, extreme weather, has led sort of the social partners there to say, well, look, if somebody's going to go to work, once they turn up for their schedule and they punch in, they should be paid. And even if it's up to the employer to find them work to do if their specific work task is not there, but they should be paid, because it's the view I think from the social actors is that it's not exactly fair to make a worker go in, clock in, they say sorry, no, go home, and we'll let you know, or we'll give you a call to come in to do the work. Well, the workers losing time in terms of the transit. They're losing money because they're expecting that this wage is going to be paid, and they're not being paid any wage if they're on call and unpaid. And that also goes to, I think, for workers, the important feature there is, and it kind of touches on the wage protection theme, which is predictability. You need to be able to predict your working hours. Especially if you're an hourly worker, you need to be able to know how many hours of work you need per week to pay your bills. This is a really important issue. So if an employer is saying, well, I'll call you when there's work, that's a huge issue, not just in terms of workers who might be on an on-call, who might be under certain circumstances under that, but even in terms of broad-scale scheduling. This is one of the criticisms I would say that's been very, very strong with regard to the internet-based companies, so the Ubers and companies like that. It also touches on the issues for part-time workers. Often part-time workers may not have control of their schedule. So at supermarkets, for example, they may have 3 hours this week, 2 hours, 10 hours the following week. Well, people have to pay their bills. They need to be able to predict the amount of money they want to work. So the involuntary and unpredictability are really big issues in that context. So so we try to emphasize, and we certainly try to push to some extent, obviously for a balanced approach, but to try and recognize that people have expectations, they have needs. And I think sometimes what gets lost in the discussion, there's always the press on labor costs, and we must, enterprises, the sort of global orthodoxy on enterprises is we must reduce wage costs or labor costs, broadly spoke, as much as we can. But workers are consumers. If you can't predict how much you're earning, if you can't predict how much money you're bringing in, you can only buy a certain amount. You can only participate in the economy to a certain degree. And that means that, if you're living kind of hand to mouth, it means you're not going to buy, new clothes and new shoes and new computers and new this and new that. If the less you earn, the less you're actively participating in the labor market. So there is an economic argument to say that, workers are economic actors, and the more you take, in a sense, the less that workers receive, the less they consume as consumers. So this has economic consequences at the local level, at the national level, international level. If we're looking at the data right now, there in terms of growth in sort of projected growth, the IMF and the World Bank. A lot of national central banks are kind of doing their projections now for 2021. If we look back to 2020, the only country that seemed to have maintained their level of growth was China. But part of that growth was they had an internal market where they were producing, but they were also consuming. Part of the declines that you find in many other parts of the world is consumption has gone down greatly in many parts of the world. So sorry, I hope that was probably a little long-winded, but
no.
I hope it.
Thanks. Nice. You also mentioned it about the platform economy, the gig economy. There was also another question here, like how to regulate working conditions in this platform economy. Are there any standards or mechanism that the ILO that we have available to regulate this sector?
Well, in principle, the international labor standards that we have will apply in principle to the gig economy in terms of, so in principle, the hours of work will be regulated, will the hours of work standards, the rest standards, in principle should apply to people working in the gig economy. I think that the biggest challenge with regard to the gig economy has been the fact that it's so dispersed. The challenge that we face with regard to the gig economy is these companies are, in essence, headquartered, I mean, to a large, not singularly, but to a large extent in the United States. But the work that's being done, and in the United States, it's predominantly Silicon Valley, which is in Northern California. But the work that's being done is being done by people who log on to do work in Florida, in Ontario, in Istanbul, in Morocco, in China, in Hong Kong, in especially, I mean, one of the big participants is in Bangalore, in India. And there are real questions about the number of hours, the pay, the rates of pay. Should national standards be applicable in the context? So if you're working on Amazon Turk, which will to some extent the servers will be most likely in the United States, but you're working from India. Whose wage payment, which wage rate is applicable? The national rate or the state rate in India, or the state of California and the minimum wage that would apply in the United States? These are vast differences. So there are real questions about what's the applicable circumstance, what's the applicable situation. There have been questions about the status of people who work in the gig economy. One of the things that is that's a big battleground issue between workers and employers in the industry is whether or not gig economy workers are employees or are they contractors. If they're contractors, they're governed by a different set of legal rules. Most of labor law does not apply to contractors. There are certain commercial law principles that do, but labor law principles not so much. That means that you don't get the benefits, not only the benefits of the law, for example, on working hours or on wages, or even in terms of Social Security. You don't get the benefits, but you can't use those tools to enforce against a company. If you don't fall within the sort of labor law protections, you can't use those protections to say, well, I as a contractor am not being paid the minimum wage. That's a much more difficult hill to climb in legal circumstances. So these have been issues that are that have been a big point of discussion in the office. We have produced, I would recommend reading 2 reports, again produced by colleagues in my unit. Sorry, I'm not I'm not a paid broadcaster for the products of my unit, but I think my colleagues are doing some really useful and interesting work which is why I recommend you have a look. There was one produced by the same group of colleagues on non-standard forms of employment. It's an ILO report on non-standard forms of employment that came out about, if I recall, about 2018, so about 3 years ago now. Just again, at the end of the last year, they produced a report on home-based work. And there are questions, and that's one of the questions with regard to the gig economy, whether or not gig economy work is home-based. If you're working from home, you may be working at Starbucks, you may be working at home, or you may be working at a location, but you could be working from home. If it's home-based and you're principally located at home, there may be protection. There may be some avenues through the Home Workers Convention, the ILO Home Workers Convention, to kind of consider how to structure gig economy work that's where the worker is home-based. But I would strongly recommend you have a look at that report, which just came out in 2020. We can certainly put put some of these. I can probably forward some of the links to these PDF documents to Carl, and I think perhaps he can share them with you, so you can have a more in-depth analysis and look at these issues and as to how we're sort of addressing them. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, I actually have a whole list of interesting documents from your unit that I will forward. So
the home-based work just came out. I mean,
okay.
it was just they just released the DG just released it. In January, I think they had the global release. So I can get if you need it, I can get you the links for that.
Okay, thank you. Well, any other question on this topic, which is, as Nash says, it's fairly complex, and there's not a yes/no answer always, or a black and white. If you see the paragraph on wages in the M&E declaration, it's a quite complex paragraph, and normally we get a lot of questions when we present that paragraph on wages, because it's not straightforward. It's one of the longer paragraphs in the document. But before we continue, any other question that you would like to ask Nash on the topic?
If I may?
Yes, please, you can take the floor. Yes.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask you whether you could recommend ILO studies that are about the gig economy and the consequences for collective bargaining. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say I think if I recall correctly, the non-standard forms of employment report does have some material on gig economy and collective bargaining. The home-based workers report, I must admit I haven't had a chance to read the whole report yet, but I was discussing it with the colleagues who are writing it, and I do believe that they have some material on it. I'll check to see if our collective bargaining colleagues have any specific. I seem to recall that they may have done a fact sheet or a policy brief on it, but I'll have to check. And I'll share that with Carl to pass on if it's there.
Marjolein, I also think that's a good question for next week. We have Karen Curtis with us on freedom of association and collective bargaining. I think I can actually share this question already with her in advance, so that she can also maybe prepare for these questions. Any further questions? Probably there are, but maybe burning questions at this moment on the topic. If not, okay.
I kind of scrolled back, so forgive me if I didn't. When I was doing the presentation, forgive me, I wasn't going through all the questions. But there was a question here between correlation between manufacturing and long average hours. Yeah, I mean, in a sense, I mean, when you look at the labor legislation in a lot of countries, working time, it's an interesting theme. I would say working time is a funny subject. We all kind of know what working time is kind of intuitively. You know, we all have and I think the participants in this discussion all have a sort of an approximate idea of what working hours are, what they should be. And realistically, I think this has some implications, I think, for the way it's sort of provided in terms of the way it's taught, the way it's sort of people are given information about it. I think, and it's not because I work on the subject, but when I first got to the ILO, it wasn't a subject that I had looked at in the depth that I now work on it. When you look at the regulatory instruments with regard to working time, one of the things I noted when I was doing the presentation is we differentiate between normal hours and overtime hours. A lot of labor legislation has very vague definitions on a lot of different issues. So what's normal hours, what's overtime hours, what are the maximum number of hours that anybody can work. A simple way to determine maximum hours is normal hours plus overtime hours equals maximum hours. So the maximum hours are what the law would permit by day or by week. But there are so many different variations in terms of approach and how it's done that may or may not be legal. There are certainly questions about how they're structured. There's a load of different ways in terms of structuring a daily work schedule, a weekly work schedule, or a period work schedule. There are sectoral variations with regard to working hours. So for example, when you look at national law with regard to working time, the labor code will talk about working hours sort of broadly spoke. So for most people in the private sector. However, every labor code will have exceptions. So there'll be exceptions, say, for oil and platform workers, or for mining workers, or for agricultural workers. And these are pieces of legislation that are tailored to ensure that you don't have that workers get proper rest and don't have excessive hours, but need to be tailored to the specificity of the sector itself. So for example, if you're an agricultural worker, there are certainly boom and bust times in sort of the growing calendar. There are going to be times where you need to work longer hours to plant the plants. Once the plants are planted, the crops are planted, the maintenance issues may be something that's taken care of on a more normal, quote unquote, normal daily working hour schedule. But then the harvest might require a lot of overtime that might exceed in some cases the amount that you would normally have for working time in other sectors. So this is where you have schemes of hours averaging and things of that nature. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of frame working hours in the first instance. In terms of manufacturing and in places like, so in countries like in East Asia, the laws may be framed very broadly. The long working hours may be permissible under the law, depending on how the law is set at the national level. But there are instances where there are people where there may not be compliance with the law. And the one thing I would say is a lot of I think one of the the two issues I think that most analysts, when they look at global supply chains and production in East Asia, I mean production in general, but East Asia is kind of one of the manufacturing engines of the world currently. The countries in East Asia. There's a wages and hours component. So the wage rates are may not be especially high, but the hours may be long, and that makes them attractive to companies in terms of producing their products. The question is whether they're within legal lines, whether they're within the lines of the labor code, and secondly, if they aren't, then are these hours being enforced? There sometimes are perverse consequences. So you have circumstances where there may be perverse incentives, I should say. So in one instance, one of the things I would say with regard to overtime is that I mean, this is just a personal view, this is not an institutional view, but I think overtime premia is important to include in national legislation. What I mean, for those of you who are not familiar with overtime premia, it's if I'm supposed to be paid 1 unit, if the minimum wage is 1 unit per hour, the overtime premia is 1.5 units for every overtime hour that I work. So it's an extra amount paid for the overtime hour. As on a personal level, I think it's important to include an overtime premium for several reasons. Certainly, one, if a worker is working overtime hours, they should be compensated for it to some extent. They're scheduled, in some cases, they're scheduled for a certain amount of time, and they may need to work extra because of the needs of the company. So they should be compensated for it. The other reason is that overtime hours, the use of overtime premia can act as something of a break. It's meant to act as something of a break from having really long hours. So if an employer is going to schedule a certain number of hours, it's meant to kind of, you can use overtime, but the idea of using overtime is kind of break glass in case of emergency kind of situation. It's not meant, it wasn't sort of structurally designed to kind of be an active incorporated part of the schedule. The issue though is, because it's a premia, in some cases, the perverse consequence of the premia is that in some instances, workers will actually press to get overtime hours. They actually don't want to have the restriction. They're actually in favor of exceeding their hours, working extra, because they want the pay, because they're now factoring that into their wage and sort of overall compensation. I say this because we've had experiences working with small and medium-sized enterprises in East Asia. And these are anecdotal. I mean, this is not a sort of universal statement. These are anecdotal based on a handful of companies that we interacted with. But there was a serious pressure on the trade unions to ensure that from the workers, from their members, to get overtime, because because overtime meant that they were earning more. And certainly within certain boundaries. Now, there are certain companies where this is actually a problem, where overtime is mandatory, where the employer is making people work overtime hours, and the working hours become really excessive, and that's a much bigger issue and a much bigger problem. So I'm not going to pretend to suggest that this is a sort of a universal situation, but there is an interest in many countries where there is this type of manufacturing to get overtime compensation. So it does create sort of perverse incentives in certain instances, and it's not to have a sort of it's not to kind of limit the common sense approach, although, as Mark Twain said, common sense is not so common. It is, it is something to kind of bear in mind, and it may have an influence in terms of the long hours that are taking place, and the low wage rates combined with the overtime premium can act as an incentivized system.
In that, thank you, Nash. In any case, I would also like to remind you of the ILO help desk for business, where we have a section on wages and working time, and where you can find a lot of these issues that might happen. Please, Nash.
Yeah, no, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
I was going to answer another question that just came in.
Okay, yes. So please have a look there. There you will find a lot more questions, and that probably were answered by Nash or his colleagues on, for example, the usage of overtime and so forth. Yes, maybe the final question here on the right to disconnect, because Nash, please.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we're all contending with. Yeah. The right to disconnect, this is a subject that was raised, that was included in the discussion in the general survey on working time. It was something that we viewed as a subject that was growing in importance because of technology. It is something that is receiving more national policy interest. Prior to COVID, there was a lot of activity on this. France and Portugal, I believe, have developed some regulatory guidance on how this should be done. However, I anticipate that because of the COVID situation and because so many people are now teleworking, this subject is going to become far more, far stronger, far more visible, far more central in our discussions on issues relating to telework. And I think it's not an area that is narrowing or disappearing. COVID has magnified it, and I think it's going to grow as an issue. Some of the anecdotal data that's now coming out in the last few months, I say anecdotal because they're in some instances I've seen some company-based surveys or industry-based surveys that are not national government surveys. Consultancies running surveys in among their clients. Working hours appear to be going up for people who are teleworking. There seems to be workers feel a huge pressure to telework, to be available to telework, to be reachable. And it's creating a lot of distortions in terms of the way people work, in terms of their feelings about work. I would say what I've said, and I've said it to colleagues, what's really interesting is that, the ILO covers all kinds of labor issues. There's a wide array of subjects that the ILO covers with regard to labor and employment. Many of us have experience in some dimension. So we have colleagues who have experience with collective bargaining from an employer's or worker's side, or they themselves have faced discrimination, so that maybe they're actively working on discrimination based on sex or on race. But one of the subjects I would say, what COVID has done has turned everybody in our office into something of maybe a limited form, but it's turned us all into experts on telework. Telework is something we are all experiencing in real time. It's something that we're all having to contend with. We're all having to contend with certain pressures relating to the nature of our work, relating to the nature of our engagement with constituents. It's something that we're all trying to deal with and trying to find ways to address this in a fair and equitable manner. But it's ongoing. It's absolutely ongoing. So right to disconnect is central to that. In the ILO context, I think we're probably a bit fortunate in the sense that there is a certain respect to some extent to people's hours of work and rest. But I know that in different countries and in different organizations, enterprises, sectors of the economy, sometimes in the public sector as well, in countries either at the state or provincial or national level, the right to disconnect is a real serious issue because the technology now has become so ubiquitous. It used to be that technology took a lot of time to be more widely dispersed and available. Mobile phones, tablets, laptop computers, but especially mobile phones, are common everywhere. Anywhere in the world you go to, you will find people with mobile phones. It doesn't matter what economy you're talking about, whether you're talking about, the most industrialized or the least industrialized, people have mobile phones. This is good. This is changing the dimension and the ways in which people work. And are they, to touch on the previous question, are they on call? On call and right to disconnect are two principles that are very intimately linked. So the question is how do we address it? To what extent can we use international labor standards in the context of the ILO, but to what extent are national regulations applicable? And again, if we're talking about, just as an example, I'm currently speaking to you from Geneva. Carl is speaking to you from Turin. Now, European sort of regulations are not hugely different. I mean, there's a lot of similarity, but you know, we also have colleagues in Lima, Peru. We have colleagues in Bangkok, in Thailand. We have colleagues in Beirut, in Lebanon, in Pretoria, in South Africa. In, you know, we're the International Labor Organization. In principle, you know, that's the standards that are set by the office should guide all offices. But what if you're a multinational? What then? Do you have a right to disconnect? Is there a right to disconnect if you are working for a multinational that's headquartered in the US, but you're working in Russia, or you're working in Saudi Arabia, or you're working in Brazil, or you're working in China? What are the applicable laws? I mean, they can vary. And the right to disconnect is, I would say the right to disconnect is in its infancy at the moment. We are just coming to terms with this subject, and perhaps it should be something that's more advanced, but we haven't. But it will be. I would speculate that it is something that is gonna develop, and it's going to become more prominent in our work, not less.
Or maybe we should not be happy when the office gives you an office phone, huh?
Yeah. Well,
you know, no office phone. I don't need an office phone.
Well, you know, you're right. You know, it does raise certain questions at the moment. For example, right to disconnect. Okay, well, does everybody have the same internet service? You know, a lot of us are teleworking. Do we have the same internet service? Who bears the cost? You know, phone subscriptions, who bears the cost? And that can influence the right to disconnect. The amount of money you're spending can have an influence.
Exactly. Thank you, Nash. Let's disconnect in a few minutes, because we're close to 4. So Nash, thank you very much for being again with us. I took the liberty of putting your email address there. I don't think you will be overwhelmed by all the email messages, but I know you would welcome if anybody has any further follow-up question. Nash can help you further. Maybe direct you also to one of the colleagues if it's very specific questions, or otherwise always the help desk for business is always there with Emily. That's even the easiest way. Thank you again, Nash. And I have here a few slides, service announcements for next week. This is the agenda. We only have 2 of the what we call then the more technical webinars. We have one on gender and non-discrimination or equal opportunity on Tuesday afternoon, and on Thursday we have the session on freedom of association and collective bargaining. These are the 2 ones that are scheduled in the agenda, but we also have 2 sessions that are a bit shorter. They will not last for 2 hours, I promise. There will be even less, where we speak with 2 of our colleagues that are really considered experts on the topic. We will have Ben Smith talking on child labor, and Martin Oels working on the topic of indigenous peoples. And this particular convention, Convention 169 on indigenous and tribal peoples, which is within the world of responsible business conduct, is a prominent convention which is administered by the ILO. For that purpose, I really would like to ask you to if you have specific questions on these 2 topics. They really asked me, but if they have specific questions they would like to raise, being on due diligence, on access to remedy, on, I don't know, policies, frameworks, business engagement, and so forth, please feel free to post them already in the eCampus, where you will find these 2 forums that are linked to each Meet the Expert. And then, as you could see, I hope that you, the assignments that we provide you, these are very short capacity building assignments, 10-15 minutes for you already to have a good idea of what the topic is about. So feel free to take also this one on equal opportunity and treatment, which is online. The meeting with the experts, I see Pedro asking me what is the time of this meeting. It's indeed it's at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Turin time, from 3 to 4 in the afternoon. And I think that's it. So next rendezvous is on Tuesday, 9 February from 2 to 4. And I wish you all a very well disconnected weekend. And we see each other next week. So enjoy the rest of your Friday, and I see you next week, Tuesday. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye bye. Thank you. Have a nice weekend.